what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a few slides about what's going on around the states. As some of you may know, we've got a retirement crisis, and we have a number of things are going around the states. And then we're going to hear from Jim, who's from Maryland and is a small business, and is going to talk about how this would affect small business. And then we have our wonderful Steve Kreisberg from AFSCME, who we've heard from AFSCME, and who has been working with us, and not with just me, but with many states through AFSCME to get retirement reform happening in the states, as well as at the federal government. So that's the plan. Now, one of the things that I'm not good at, as you can tell, is how to make this work. Okay.
There you go.
So, Gallup poll has done polls since 2000 and has discovered that 77% of Americans fear retirement more than they fear death. And 82% of families with children, which is an even higher number, fear retirement more than they fear death. And why that's important to understand is, what does fear do? AARP, and there are a few of you here from AARP, have done some studies, and they've discovered that there are 3 words that people fear. They really don't like. And those 3 words are retirement, planning, and elderly. So when you think about how you're going to solve these problems, it's difficult if you can't use those 3 words. And it's even more difficult when you understand, what does fear do to you? And I give this as an example. Those of you who have read War and Peace, which I'm sure you remember. In War and Peace, when Napoleon, remember War and Peace? I know. It's so funny. I just spoke at a college. I was a Woodrow Wilson Fellow at McHenry College this week, which is near St. Louis. It's actually in Illinois. It's near St. Louis. None of them had read War and Peace, because they don't read the classic books anymore. But of course, all of you have read War and Peace, because you were required to read it, so you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, I had no idea what I was talking about. Anyway, Napoleon, as you remember, gets to Moscow. And what do the people in Moscow do when Napoleon is at Moscow edge? They drink, they party, they play. Why do they do that? Because they are so afraid they can't do anything else. They can't fight back, they can't gather themselves to fight or to do anything. So when people are afraid, they are immobilized, and they basically put their heads in their sand, or they drink, or do drugs, or whatever it is that they are addicted to. Anyway, that's a really big problem for us who are trying to deal with the issue of retirement, because people don't want to hear about it. Planning being one of the big words, they don't want to plan, because they feel guilty that they haven't planned. So this is a very important slide. Do you know who that is? That's the Grim Reaper. Yeah, exactly. And they're right to be afraid, because I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Okay, they're right to be afraid because they haven't really saved much. 52% of Americans have less than $10,000 in savings. You probably already know this. It's very scary. 11%, the top 10%, of course, have $250,000 and more. But the big point is 52% of Americans are really in trouble, $10,000 and less in savings. And what somebody once saw this slide, and I still haven't gotten my act together to improve it. Not only do they have a lot less in savings, they're in debt. They have children, they have mortgage debt, they have credit card debt, and they have student debt, and they're not just don't have savings, they owe a lot of money, and they're worried. So why is there a crisis? One, it's not very difficult to figure out. We're living longer. All of you know this, employer-based savings have disappeared, and we have meager savings. And basically, employers are not offering a plan for them. We're living longer because many of those in this room have done a terrific job to get us to stop smoking and eating well and living. So we've done well. We're making sure we live better and we exercise, but that means that we've got issues on the other end. Now, the question is, who does get employer-based savings? And it really goes back to Adam Smith, the economies of scale. If you have a lot of people, it's easier to set up an employer-based plan. So unions, 82% of unions have retirement plans. Large employers, 74% of large employers, and government. Big employers have plans. So you see Scrooge. Now, many people who read Dickens, which of course you've all read in this room, thought that Scrooge is really a creepy person. But what you really understand if you look at the data is he was just a small business owner. And small business owners can't afford to take care of their employees because it's too difficult to set it up. So employers with fewer than 10 workers, only 17% of them have been able to set up an employee-based plan. And those employers that do are employers that are basically very wealthy. They could be an investment management firm or a high-tech firm. They're not your local beauty salon. I just got hearing aids. I know that you all wanted to hear that, but I was talking to my doctor and I said, I'm doing retirement security. I bet you don't have a retirement plan for your workers because she only had 2 employees. She said, yes, I do. I have a defined benefit plan. She has a defined benefit plan for 2 people. Why? Because it's a high-end business. And so if she's very wealthy, she wants to keep her employee, she sets up a good plan. So if you are very wealthy, you can do a good plan. But most small businesses don't have as much money as apparently. And since I've lost 3 hearing aids, she's doing very well by me. And you can see from this chart who gets the employer-based plan. So as you saw, and we saw yesterday, and we've seen for the last few years, the federal government is not doing their job to solve the problem of retirement. When I was lieutenant governor a long time ago, we never even imagined that we would do anything in retirement. This was not a discussion. We discussed crime, we discussed economic development, we discussed children, youth, and families, we had a Department of Aging, but none of this we ever discussed retirement. I guarantee you, this would never cross my lips. It would not once. And yet, over the last 5 years, 26 states have now looking at retirement. I think it's up to 30. My slides are sometimes out of date. And 5 states have passed legislation. And Illinois is, so that's the change that's really going on. And what I would say 3 of those states are really sort of shared. They're called the secure choice states, Illinois, Oregon, and California. Other states are doing studies, but of those 3 states, and I would count Maryland as one of them. I was the chair of their task force, and now I'm on, when it was a governor's task force, now it's a legislative task force. What they share, and we can get into the questions if you're interested, every employer should do it. No choice, you got to do it. It should be simple, no complicated way of doing it, so that it's easy to follow. It should be automatic, you heard that from the panel already, and it should be pooled. You heard about the cost of fees. 1% is really expensive, and 1% over 30 years is almost 30%. You should not have to do that. The federal system, I get different numbers about how much the federal system comes. My favorite number is 0.03% because it sounds so little and makes everybody jealous of the federal system, but And I said this to actually Vermont, because I was asked to go up and testify in Vermont, and they said, we have 100,000 people who aren't covered. And I said, well, 100,000 sounds like a lot, but it's not that money compared to 5 million. Why don't you find a few other states you could work with? And they said, great, let's go work with Maine and New Hampshire, maybe Rhode Island, so you could combine states and get a lot of people in the system and lower your fees. Remember my earlier slide? I don't know if you paid attention to Adam Smith, economies of scale, unions, large employers, more people in the system, you lower the fees. Okay? Can you remember that? Just trying to say, what are the takeaways from this presentation? You want to have really low fees. And you want to have a lot of people in the system so that one person doesn't have to bear all the risk themselves. So these are the common design features. I'm not going to go through them in great detail because, to tell you the truth, if you're really interested, you're going to figure it out for yourself. Everybody in this room, if you've read War and Peace, you've read Dickens, you're going to figure this out too. You come to this country, if you're coming here, you know what's going on. But what's interesting is each of these states are going to say, we want low fees. They're doing market analyses. They're telling their employers, you got to do this. And really, there is a fight. Does anybody want to know? Can anybody guess what the fight is in the states? No. It's not between Democrats and Republicans. Interestingly enough, one of the few places in the country, it's the center that we founded in Maryland, at the Georgetown Center. We actually have Angela's a Republican. I'm a Democrat. I knew doesn't come as much as a surprise. But the idea is really it's the brokers versus people who like pooled fund and professional management. So it's different parts of the financial industry that are fighting over this. Which is of no interest, I can tell, to anybody in this room. Okay, that's really boring.
Yeah, it is.
Yes.
I can see eyes down. What is she talking about? In other audiences, people care. You guys, I can see, do not care at all. Okay, let me just go. This is my final slide, and then I will.
Questions at the end.
Bloomberg, you might care. Okay.
Look behind me.
Huh?
I care behind me.
Oh, okay, you care behind me. Okay, let me just finish this, and then you can go on. So basically, there are lots of possible plan designs. I'm just going to mention 4 briefly. There is something called an individual retirement account, which is the 3 plan designs out of California, Illinois, and you are paying attention. Thank you, Jeremy.
And you forgot Connecticut.
Well, I testified in front of Connecticut. I am pushing them on something else. The other idea would be, and that's just the 401k, the individual retirement account. They went that way because they didn't want to be controlled by the federal government, the ERISA. Now, how many here have heard of ERISA? Oh, I'm so glad. Well, have.
Everyone's heard of it.
Okay, so just so you know, I love ERISA. My daughter, went to a wedding and for her girlfriend, and the woman married another woman named ERISA. Because the parents thought that the daughter, ERISA was the best law that had ever been passed to protect people's pensions. So it was important to protect people.
Okay.
Good idea.
It's okay. Yeah, it's okay.
So they don't want to be under ERISA. Okay, that's an issue which we can get into later. But the problem with the individual retirement account, as far as I'm concerned, is it doesn't allow the employer to give. So I prefer something called a 401k multiple employer plan, which allows the employer to also contribute. And it would be under ERISA so people would get the protections, because I think people need consumer protections. And I can get into that in greater detail if you're interested. There's a clearinghouse exchange marketplace, which is Washington State. I was at something called the National Association of State Treasurers on Sunday in Nashville, and I asked the state treasurer from Washington State to describe that plan, and he said, I've never heard of it, I didn't even know it passed. He clearly doesn't like it, and it's his own state plan. So I don't think that's a very good plan. Apparently he doesn't. I mean, I only say that because the treasurer himself refused to even mention it. And the fourth is the Treasury bond plan, which Arun has come up with, which is basically saying, and I asked Arun to come, which basically says people can buy a bond, and which is a much safer way to save, because when you put money in, it accumulates, and then when you retire, you can deaccumulate, and you don't have to take the risk of the market. So these other three, you take some risk in the market, but you also have an upside of the market. His, you don't have the risk of the market. So there's going to be a large discussion, I guarantee, over the next few years about the best way to do it. You might have a hybrid, some risk, some no risk of the market, and that's, people will have an education about what they want to do, and the states will have to decide what's the best plan. And on that, we're going to talk to a small business owner, because some small businesses think this is a burden on them, but Jim will describe why. I don't know what Jim will do, but I hope he'll do the right thing.
You know what he'll do. He'll be all right.
Thank you. And Jim is from Maryland. He was on our task force. He's been on the on both task forces in Maryland, and he's testified on the Maryland plan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, we've got some technical
I gotta switch the,
expertise here that we need. Except that's not me, but that's all right. There we go. All right. Thank you. As the Lieutenant Governor mentioned, I'm Jim Ratcheff. I'm a small business owner here in Maryland. I actually own 3.5 small businesses. One of them is incorporated as a regular C corporation here in the state of Maryland. We've got about 80 employees now. When we started, we had about a dozen. So we've grown over the years. Small business Ratcheff Enterprises, that's real estate holding, that is the boring stuff. What everybody's always interested in is Frog Eye Farm. My wife and her twin sister operate a 40-acre organic blueberry farm in Washington County. So nobody ever wants to talk about the cancer research that we do at DMS, right? Everybody wants to know about the blueberries. And then we're hopefully going to do a B Corporation here next year, Roland James, that's going to center around clothing and textiles, a B Corporation that's also really focused on trying to in-source and locally source as much as possible. And if anybody cares about talking about how difficult it is to source textiles locally in the U.S., we can talk about that later. With such a great group of public sector and nonprofit folks in the room, I should probably mention I chair the zoning board in the city of Frederick, so we do have some commonality here. But in all honesty, it would probably behoove some of my business counterparts to spend more time in the room listening to some of these issues and listening to some of these policy issues, and being able to participate in the conversation a little bit more fully. Instead, we often find ourselves busy and bogged down, especially when you're looking at very small operations. My concern about this over a number of years led to a group of us business owners getting together here in Maryland to form kind of a loose compact of small business owners who actually speak to our policymakers and our elected officials about small business issues. Often when we see the folks on TV and the talking heads, amazingly, the people talking about small business seem to own really, really super large businesses, or from really big organizations that get a lot of money from really big businesses. And so the notion is that if we're going to be heard and we're going to be considered, we need to be able to show up and participate and kind of talk about the things that really matter to us and really impact us. a bunch of statistics here about small business economies here in the United States. 28 million firms. We comprise almost 100% of all the firms. The number of firms in the country are small businesses. For the last 2 decades, we've accounted for 63% of the net new job growth, 42% of private sector employee, 46% of the economic output, 37% of the high-tech jobs, 98% of all exporting firms. Until I got ready to put this slide deck together, I never realized that 98% of our exports come through small business. Something that's also interesting, if you talk about innovation, small firms patent at a rate 16 times that of large firms per capita employee. So if you're really looking at the innovation economy, we're really talking about small business. In Maryland, we've got 500,000 small businesses, over 1 million workers employed by these small businesses. More than 40% of employers, and you heard this morning if you were in the session, don't sponsor a workplace retirement savings plan for their employees, and most of the people who don't offer a plan are small business. And the Lieutenant Governor talked about that with her statistics from the AARP as well. This is teeny tiny print. So I should mention, I personally completely believe that we've got a moral authority and moral responsibility to care for folks in our community, right? So a lot of my slides and what I'm talking about is specifically how it affects business, but I also think there's a moral component to it as well, and I don't want that to get lost. We small business owners care very passionately about the folks that work with us and work for us. Much of our success is due to their efforts. We want to take care of them, right? That's the conundrum that we find ourselves in. The gentleman this morning talking about, and he said, in the Social Security system, there's always going to be winners and losers. And I was thinking, well, there's folks that lost really a whole lot in the economic system, and so maybe they're going to lose a teeny tiny bit less in retirement. We've got folks that are really disadvantaged, and we've got a responsibility there. But from the business side, we spend 36% more than large firms to comply with federal regulations. We spend 3 times the cost per capita per employee to comply with tax regulations and tax compliance, and 4.5 times per employee to comply with things like environmental regulations. All important things, but compared to our big business counterparts, it leaves us with a lot less flexibility and a lot less funding. More money, more problems, less money, more problems. We're also often financing with personal assets rather than being able to go to Bank of America and get some huge line of credit. We get loans at a rate less than half the time of large corporations, and also at half the success rate. So not only are we getting loans approved at a lower amount, we're also getting them approved at a lower rate of approval. So it leaves us to fall back on our personal assets to be able to fund ongoing operations. We can't offer always the same benefits and the same sort of stability and environment that maybe a large business can. So we have difficulty recruiting and retaining employees. Often the most highly qualified employees can get snatched up by folks that can pay on the differential. Aside from salary, the presence of a benefit like a 401k plan is the number one reason that employees choose a prospective employer. And also when, oh, yes.
How old are your employees when they choose? I mean, I think of older employees choosing an employer with a 401k plan more than younger employees.
Our younger employees, so it's our younger employees are young, right? And so they have all the.
Well, what does young mean to you?
Well, so my youngest employee this year was 15. I had one 15-year-old, but we do have some folks that start with us at 18, 19, 21, 22. And like we all probably were at 19 and 20. We'd rather have a motorcycle or an Xbox and put some money away for retirement.
Oh, yeah. We can't do questions because we don't get to Steve.
Oh, and I'm sorry. They don't see the importance of it as much. But the other thing from the side is that we have less money, and because we have a smaller pool of employees. Often the brokers that we've talked about see us as less profitable by far. So if you think back to that first slide, my 80-person company, I get calls every 6 months by people saying, hey, can we help you with your 401k? My smaller companies, and I've been testifying on this issue for 4 years, you would think that at least one person would have picked up just to say that they did it, right? I have never been called by anybody to help me set up a retirement program for my employees with a smaller business, ever. So we've talked about some of these challenges, and I don't want to take too much time away from Steve either, but there's a lot of reasons why we feel like we're challenged in offering plans. There's a lot of complexity out there to navigate it. Because we don't have the economies of scale that Kathleen talked about, we're paying higher costs, both on the employer side and the employee side. We have limited choices. If you have a very big 401k pot of money, it's amazing how many options you have for offering options to your employees. Confidence in the folks that might be coming to us and saying, well, hey, we've got something here that we can offer you. Having to take on that fiduciary risk and the competing priorities and responsibilities that we have when we're working 14-hour days. And I was going to say, maybe I can, because I think Kathleen spoke to some of this too. Really, part of the statements that I've been making from the side of the small business too is that people say, hey, you know, you're going to put a burden on business owners by asking them to provide a 401k. But if we look at the statistics and the rate at which people are retiring, how long the longevity is, and if you think back to those statistics earlier about who's bearing the share of tax and regulatory burden, what's going to happen when we have twice as many seniors unprepared for retirement, right? Small business taxes and middle class income taxes are going to go up. So to me, I think we've got to look at this like a long game from a business perspective rather than what it's going to cost me to sign somebody up. We process payroll for folks in one of my companies. We did a little calculation. It would cost us $4.71 to sign somebody up for an IRA or a shared 401k per employee, $4. To me, that's a very, very small burden to ask to bear to be able to provide a little bit more stability to somebody.